Off the southern end of Haida Gwaii, an island chain off British Columbia, a research ship trailed a robot through the dark water, and on the screens above deck, a picture of the seafloor scrolled past, hundreds of feet below the waves. In among the sonar shadows, the team saw something that made them stop. A line of rocks, each the size of a basketball, lying in a long, deliberate row across the seabed, in a place that made no sense for the modern ocean. But it made perfect sense for an ancient shore, because that patch of seafloor had not always been underwater. At the end of the last ice age, the sea around these islands stood far lower than it does now, and this drowned plain had been dry land, where rivers ran and people could walk. The line of rocks looked like a fish weir, built by human hands on a riverbank now 400 feet beneath the sea. And the Haida, whose islands these are, have always said they were here at the beginning, through a time when the world changed. So what lies on the drowned coast off Haida Gwaii? And how does a people's memory of a lower sea line up with a shoreline now hidden underwater? To follow that question honestly, we have to start with the land itself, or rather with the land that is no longer there. Haida Gwaii is a rugged archipelago of islands, once called the Queen Charlotte Islands, lying off the northern coast of British Columbia across a stretch of open water. It is the homeland of the Haida Nation, a people famous for their great cedar canoes, their monumental carved poles, and a deep artistic tradition, and it is a place of dense rainforest, steep shores, and rich, cold, teeming seas. But the coastline you would see there today is not the coastline that has always been. The story of the sea around Haida Gwaii since the Ice Age is unusually complicated, because as the great ice sheets grew and melted, they pressed the land down and let it rise, and the sea rose and fell, all at different rates in different places. The key fact, though, is simple enough. For a long stretch at the end of the last Ice Age, roughly the period when the first people were moving into this coast, the sea around much of Haida Gwaii stood dramatically lower than it does now, in places well over 300 feet lower. That drop exposed a wide apron of land around the islands, a coastal plain that is now completely submerged. Hundreds of square miles of what is now seafloor were once open country, with shorelines, river mouths, and estuaries, exactly the kind of rich coastal ground that early peoples favored. And then, as the Ice Age ended and the meltwater poured back into the oceans, the sea rose and drowned all of it, sliding up over the old plain and pushing the coastline back to roughly where it sits today. An entire ancient landscape and any trace of the people who may have lived on it went underwater and stayed there. There is one place where you can almost step into that vanished world, right at the edge of the water. At a site called Kilgii Gwaay, in the intertidal zone at the far south of Haida Gwaii, archaeologists have excavated an early camp that is roughly 10,700 years old, lying at a spot where the ancient shoreline sat close to the modern one. Because it has been waterlogged and sealed for all that time, the site preserved things that almost never survived from so long ago. Not just stone tools, but worked wood and bone, the remains of meals, and the traces of people who hunted seals and sea lions, caught fish and birds, and lived richly off this coast at the very dawn of the present age of the world. Kilgii Gwaay is solid ground, literally and scientifically, a proven early-Holocene settlement that shows how skilled and how at home the first coastal people already were. And it sits right at the shoreline. Everything older and everything lower lies out under the water. That is the setting for one of the most difficult and ambitious kinds of archaeology there is, the search for drowned sites on the seafloor. For decades, the assumption on many coasts was that anything on those old shorelines was simply lost, scattered and buried under the sea, impossible to find. But a team of archaeologists working in Haida Gwaii, including Daryl Fedje and Quentin Mackie, refused to accept that the drowned plain was beyond reach. They reasoned that if they could reconstruct exactly where the old shorelines had been, they could predict where ancient people would most likely have camped and fished, at the mouths of former rivers and along the old beaches, and then go looking in those precise places on the seabed. It is painstaking work, combining the geology of sea level change, detailed mapping of the underwater terrain, and the patient use of ships, sonar, robots, and sampling equipment to examine a seafloor no human eye can easily reach. The method is almost like detective work run in reverse. First, the team builds a model of where the sea stood at different moments after the Ice Age, tracing how the old shorelines rose and fell as the land and the water rebalanced. Then they look for the drowned river mouths and former beaches, the addresses where ancient people would most plausibly have lived, and they aim their instruments precisely there rather than dragging blindly across the whole seabed. On one survey, off the south of the islands, an underwater robot spent days running back and forth above the drowned plain, sweeping it with sonar to build a fine map of the bottom, and it was in that data that the long line of rocks first appeared. And remarkably, the wider effort has produced real results, because the search actually found things, and the finds are the heart of this story. In one early success, the team recovered a stone tool from the seafloor, brought up from the drowned bottom in a sediment sample, a worked artifact lying where an ancient shore had been, proof that human hands had been active on land that is now under the sea. Think about the odds of that. To reach down through hundreds of feet of ocean and bring up a single tool dropped on a beach thousands of years ago is a little like finding one particular grain of sand in the dark, and yet the careful narrowing of the search made it possible. And later, using an underwater robot carrying sonar to map the seabed in fine detail, they identified that long line of rocks, basketball-sized stones, set in a row on the drowned plain roughly 400 feet down, which they interpreted as a possible stone fish weir. Weirs like it were built by coastal peoples all over the world. Simple fences of stone or wood set in a river or tidal channel to trap fish as they moved, and a weir on that ancient shoreline would fit everything known about how early people lived on this coast. The evidence for very early human presence in the region is strong. On land and in the intertidal zone of Haida Gwaii, sites have been found reaching back some 13,000 years, to a time when the islands were a cooler, more open landscape, grassland and scattered trees rather than the deep rainforest of today. Researchers have even spoken of people catching salmon on this coast close to 14,000 years ago, before the great forests had grown, when the drowned plain was still dry land under an open sky. So the picture that emerges from the seafloor is astonishing. People were living, fishing, and building on the coast of Haida Gwaii at the very end of the Ice Age, and part of the record of that life now lies beneath 400 feet of cold Pacific water. So the physical facts are these. The sea around Haida Gwaii once stood far lower. A broad coastal plain now drowned lay open to early people, and on that seabed, archaeologists have recovered a stone tool and mapped a line of rocks that may be an ancient fish weir, alongside land sites reaching back 13,000 years. Much of that is checkable, mapped, and published, but the moment a line of rocks on the seabed gets called a fish weir, and the moment a modern people's oral history seems to echo it, an honest documentary has to slow down. Because this is exactly where certainty runs ahead of the evidence. If you enjoy slow documentaries that stay careful, even when the story gets exciting and refuse to overclaim, consider subscribing, because it genuinely helps these longer videos reach the people who like them. Because the underwater weir, remarkable as it is a possibility and not yet a proven fact, and the honest version of this story has to say so plainly. Here is the hard part, and it cuts in two directions. Start with the rocks on the seabed. A line of basketball-sized stones on a drowned plain is a very suggestive thing, and a fish weir is a reasonable interpretation, but the deep seafloor is a difficult witness. Rocks can be arranged by nature as well as by people, dropped in rows by melting ice, sorted by ancient currents, or left by a retreating glacier. And telling a human-made structure from a natural one is hard enough on dry land and far harder through 400 feet of water using sonar and robots. To confirm that the line of rocks is truly a weir, and to date it, would take much more direct investigation than anyone has yet been able to do at that depth. So the responsible archaeologists themselves describe it as a possible or probable weir, not a certain one, and we should hold it exactly that loosely. The recovered stone tool and the early land sites are far more solid. The weir on the seabed is a tantalizing maybe. And there is a second caution about the oral history. The Haida do carry deep traditions of a changing world, of a great time of transformation, and it is genuinely tempting to line those up directly with the drowning of the coastal plain and say, the Haida, remember the sea, rising 13,000 years ago? But proving that any specific oral tradition preserves the memory of a specific event across that unimaginable span is beyond what the evidence can support, and stories of floods and of a changed world are found among peoples all over the earth. So we hold both cautions firmly. The weir is unconfirmed, and the direct link between a modern story and an ancient flood cannot be proven. And even after granting all of that, what remains is still a deep and genuine convergence. Because the convergence that survives every caution is the biggest one of all, and it is not really about a single weir. It is about who was here and for how long. The Haida have always said that they have lived in Haida Gwaii since time immemorial, that their presence in these islands reaches back to the very beginning and through a time when the world itself was remade. Haida oral tradition is rich with deep time and with transformation, with the figure of the raven who helps bring the world into its present form, with supernatural beings tied to particular places, and with accounts of a world that took its shape through great changes rather than standing still and finished. Woven through these histories is a strong sense of an older order of things, a time before the coast looked the way it looks now. For a long time, that claim of unimaginable antiquity was treated by outsiders as merely a story, a poetic way of speaking rather than a record of anything real. And then the archaeology began to catch up with it, Every drowned shoreline mapped, every seafloor tool recovered, every early site found in the intertidal zone pushes the proven human presence in Haida Gwaii deeper and deeper into the past, back to the very edge of the Ice Age, to the era of the drowning of the coast. The Haida oral histories describe exactly that kind of deep time and exactly that kind of transforming world, a time when the land had a different shape and the waters rose. And the science, working entirely independently, keeps confirming the one thing those histories most insist upon, which is that the Haida and their ancestors have been in this place for an almost inconceivably long time, since before the forests, since when the drowned plain was dry. The obvious objection is worth meeting head-on. Does the underwater archaeology prove the Haida remember the Ice Age flood? No, and we should not claim it does. What it proves is that the Haida were right about the depth of their own history, right that their roots in these islands run back to the changing world at the end of the Ice Age, a claim now supported by tools and shorelines on the seabed. That is a quieter kind of vindication than a remembered flood, and it is also a more solid and more important one. And it would be a mistake to trade that hard-won, evidence-based wonder for a neat but unprovable claim that a story is a literal memory. None of the deepest questions here are fully closed, and the honest film leaves them open. We cannot yet confirm the underwater weir. We cannot connect any single tradition to any single event, and we cannot walk the drowned plain as it was. But we can separate the solid ground from the open water. Here is what nobody seriously disputes. The sea around Haida Gwaii once stood far lower, exposing a wide coastal plain that is now submerged, and that plain was drowned as the Ice Age ended. Archaeologists led by Daryl Fedje and Quentin Mackie recovered a stone tool from the seafloor and mapped a line of rocks on the drowned plain that may be an ancient fish weir. Land and intertidal sites on Haida Gwaii reach back some 13,000 years to when the islands were open country, and the Haida oral histories describe a deep past and a transformed world, and assert a presence in these islands from time immemorial that the archaeology increasingly supports. Those are the solid stones. Here's where the questions begin. We do not know for certain whether the line of rocks on the seabed is a human-made weir or a natural feature, because confirming it at that depth is beyond what has yet been done. We do not know whether the Haida traditions of a changing world preserve a true memory of the drowning coast, or whether that resemblance is a meaningful inheritance or a coincidence of the human tendency to remember floods. And we can never fully recover the drowned landscape, the rivers and shores and camps now lying under hundreds of feet of the Pacific. Visit Haida Gwaii today, and the drowned coast is invisible, hidden beneath the swells, but the living Haida nation is anything but. The Haida co-manage the protected lands and waters of Gwaii Haanas at the southern end of the archipelago, where much of this underwater work has taken place, and they are full partners in the ongoing search of the seafloor for the shorelines of their ancestors. That partnership matters, because this is not outsiders studying a vanished people. It is a living nation helping to recover its own deep past, guiding the work in its own waters and holding the oral history that gives the drowned shoreline its meaning. The great carved poles still stand in the old village sites. The cedar canoes are still built and paddled, and the Haida language and stories are carried forward by a people who never left. The old plain is down there still, dark and cold and quiet, holding whatever else it holds, off the coast of a nation that was there before it drowned. History is rarely settled by a single discovery, and some of it lies drowned beneath the sea, waiting for the tools that can finally reach it. It is assembled slowly, one seafloor tool, one mapped shoreline, one honored tradition at a time, and sometimes the deepest thing an ancient landscape can teach us is that a people were telling the truth about their own beginnings all along. The Haida drowned coast sits in that space, the lower sea real, the ancient tool real, the Haida presence real and unbroken. The plain was dry, the sea rose, the Haida were already there. Thank you for looking under the water with me. If you would like more of these, the kind that stay honest about what the evidence can and cannot prove, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what the next one does. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When a people say they have been somewhere since the world was young, and the drowned shore beneath their islands keeps handing up the proof, what is the difference, in the end, between a memory and a landscape?